introduction, and I'm going to see if I can slightly make it work. Yes, this is the Manhattan Project National Historical Park. But before I start going into my introduction, I do want to say that when I started working at the laboratory over 30 years ago, never in my wildest dreams would I have ever thought that we would have had a national park unit inside the boundaries of a top secret laboratory. So, but thinking about it, as I was making the drive down, 5-hour drive to be here today. So I get a little bit tired at the end of the stops because I might just, get out a little bit. But I was thinking, well, why is that so surprising? Why is it so surprising that there's a national park unit inside a national laboratory? And actually, it's not that surprising because the reason why I have a job at the laboratory is that the Department of Energy owns and manages the whole area of the laboratory. And there's a federal compliance regulation, National Historic Preservation Act. Okay? And the DOE has to stay in compliance with that act. And over the 30 years that I've been working there, of course, we've been trying to protect archaeological resources. We've excavated our, prehistoric ruins. We've been trying to save buildings over the years. But the National Historic Preservation Act doesn't just say mitigate adverse effects to cultural resources. It says consider what are your most important resources and come up with plans to preserve them, right? So over the years, we've been preserving what's left of the Manhattan Project, and lo and behold, sort of the ultimate preservation is to have them part of the Park Service in perpetuity, right, for the American public. So it does sound like a strange kind of relationship to have the Department of Energy and the Department of Interior working together so closely with this new sort of new park for the new century of parks. But actually, it's really not that surprising. It really isn't. So back to the Manhattan Project National Historical Park. It was authorized in December of 2014, and that means President Barack Obama signed the legislation that authorized the park, right? But it was established in November 2015, and that had to do with the way the legislation was written. It is actually the 409th National Park Service unit. I don't know what the current number is right now, but I believe it's over 414, somewhere in there. Okay. It is a fairly unique park. It is a 3-state park in Tennessee, Washington, and New Mexico. There are a few units that do cross state boundaries, like historic trails. I think the Underground Railroad units go through different states. But this is actually part of the challenge of this park, is it is in 3 states spread out over the country. For the centennial, the park's units across the country had pretty much one common goal, and that was to develop a foundation document for every park unit in the system. A foundation document is kind of like a park management plan, but it's a shorter document, and it identifies the purpose for the park, it identifies the key resources, some of the values of the park, and we had to, even though we were a brand new park, we're not even a year old right now, we had to come up with our own foundation document. This is currently in draft, and it's online undergoing public review, but I wanted to read to you just a little bit about the park through this draft park purpose. Why was this park established? So, it's managed in partnership by the Department of Energy and the National Park Service. Manhattan Project National Historical Park preserves and interprets the nationally significant historic sites, stories, and legacies associated with the top secret race to develop an atomic weapon during World War II, and provides access to these sites, and this is the big underline here, consistent with the mission of the Department of Energy. So, tonight I'm going to talk about the origins of the park. I'm going to focus mostly on my experience with some of the work that was done here in New Mexico. But I think a lot of the same kind of work was being done in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and Hanford, Washington, because you really needed 30, 40 years of preservation to still have something left today to be part of the park. And that didn't happen randomly. People all over this country had to be involved in preserving these places. I'm going to talk about legislation, little bit about how the park is structured. I'm going to go into quite a bit of detail with a lot of slides on the resources of the park, and try to knit them together with the World War II narrative, so you guys can kind of figure out how do all these places fit within the history of the Manhattan Project, and hopefully at the end of the lecture you'll have a little bit better idea of really what it took to make the Manhattan Project a success. I am going to talk about our first year. Right? What are our challenges? What have been the successes? What are the opportunities that we've discovered this first year that we're going to follow through with in the future? And what we think are going to be some future directions? And I don't have a crystal ball, but I know that in the next couple of years, probably what the park is going to look like. So, local origins. I started working at the laboratory in 1984. At that time, most of the focus with cultural resource management had to do with ancestral Pueblo sites on the plateau. If you're familiar with northern New Mexico, Bandelier National Monument is right next to the laboratory, and there's a wealth of prehistoric sites both on Bandelier and at the laboratory. So over the years, there was a cultural resources program that focused on preservation and protection of prehistoric sites, but not so much on the historic buildings, and mostly because they hadn't achieved 50 years of age yet. A lot of them had already been torn down by the 1960s. So, but in 1985, I was just sort of brand new at the laboratory, and we had an issue with this particular building. This is a 1945 view of the building, but in 1985, it was ready to burn. They were going to burn this building. This is how they demolished buildings back then. We don't do that today. But the New Mexico State Historic Preservation Officer got involved in the project, and we basically stopped the demolition of this building. So this was really pretty much, I look back on one of our very first historic building projects where preservation was actually part of the discussion. Go forward a little bit in time to the 1990s. There was a series of 28 buildings in a historic high explosives area. Most of them looked like this. They were dilapidated. A lot of them were contaminated with high explosives residue. They hadn't been maintained, and they were built basically as sort of temporary wartime structures, and really not meant to last for years and years. So as we were going through and doing the analysis and the documentation on these buildings, we actually had laboratory workers come to us and say, hey, you know, part of these buildings, there's a unit here called V-site. It's really significant. It's where the gadget was assembled before it was sent down to the Trinity site. Maybe we should consider taking that off the demolition list. So that's what we did. And so we were very fortunate to start collecting almost a few of the most significant properties. In fact, early on, it was a lot of the workers who contacted the cultural resources folks, because we were kind of new and we didn't really know all the history of the laboratory. The workers who were very familiar with these places, and some of them had connections back to World War II, were telling us, hey, this is a really important set of buildings. They really should be preserved. Unfortunately, and I don't know if anybody here remembers the Cerro Grande fire. It was a devastating fire. It burned through town. We lost over 400,000 units, and we also lost buildings within the boundaries of the laboratory, including 4 of the 6 buildings at B-site. I can tell you, I was at home watching the news, and they flashed this picture, and it said, historic buildings burn at Los Alamos, and I started crying. And I was at my mother's house, and she said, what's wrong, what's wrong? And I said, we worked so hard to save that place, and it all burned down. Well, it didn't actually all burn down. In fact, the 2 most significant buildings did survive the fire. I put this slide in, though, to show you what happened. This is the radiography building at B-site, and this is the high bay where the gadget assembly took place. The radiography building burned to the ground. That's what it looked like afterwards. You can see the high bay sticking up in the back. So, at about this time, and actually right before the Cerro Grande fire, we started seeing a lot of interest, more national level interest, DOE headquarters and interests, other communities across the country that had Manhattan Project resources were starting to ask, well, these are really significant. We know this is a significant event during the 20th century. What can we do to preserve the sites? And some of the sites, like K25, were being prepared for demolition. In fact, in this photo, half of the facility, a very large facility, or more than half, walk over here, all of this has been torn down, and this section here was still intact. So people started asking questions. Well, we're tearing all these places down. Do we have a plan? Do we have an idea of how to preserve these? So the Department of Energy actually started inventorying its resources, and they developed a category called Signature Facilities of the Manhattan Project. What they identified were the very key facilities at Hanford, Los Alamos, and Oak Ridge, and many of those facilities are actually now part of the park. So this was a very early and important step to basically acknowledge the national significance of these properties. And then also, in 2001, Advisory Council on Historic Preservation got involved, went to all of the different sites, and we started getting funding for the preservation of these buildings. In fact, this is the V site. Walk over here. That's the assembly building that you saw the back of. This is it before restoration, and this is during restoration. All of this is happening before there's a national park, or even a talk about national park. However, it wasn't just DOE headquarters, it wasn't just the National Trust or the Advisory Council. Local communities started really pushing their congressional delegations. We want these buildings preserved. We want a park unit. In fact, most of the towns, in fact, all of the towns had Manhattan Project resources or ties to the Manhattan Project, the DOE, and Cold War history, already had some kind of local history. They had museums, they had organizations that were already telling the story of the Manhattan Project and the Cold War. But there were various different kinds of groups, like a science museum or a museum that was focusing more on social history. And so they felt that a lot of these efforts were being bound together, and that the Park Service would be the best sort of integrating agency to bring all these local efforts together. So in 2004, Congress directed the National Park Service to conduct a feasibility study, and it very specifically said that the Department of Interior had to partner with the Department of Energy on this study. Took a couple of years to go out to all the different sites, and then by November of 2009, they were ready to issue a special resource study, their report, and it had a lot of alternatives in there. It was written like a NEPA document, but unfortunately, it only listed one alternative with a park option, and that was Los Alamos as the only park unit. While Hanford and Oak Ridge, basically, that was not going to fly. They went back to their congressional delegations and said, "What are you guys? You're kidding me? We are just as important as Los Alamos, maybe more important." So they kicked it back to the Park Service. The Park Service came back in 2010 and said, "Okay, Hanford and Oak Ridge could be park units, and Los Alamos will be the headquarters." The Park Service study really only had to answer two questions. One was, is this a story that is nationally significant? The story of the development of atomic weapons? And the answer is yes. Okay, that was the easy part. The second part is there sufficient, are there sufficient facilities, properties, artifacts, documents around that remain that can tell the story to the public? And yes, there are these facilities, and the Park Service said yes, there were. But they were very concerned because they were all pretty much owned by the Department of Energy, and they were located behind security fences in areas that the public couldn't see. This is a reoccurring theme, by the way, for this park. A park that you can't see. So, the legislation was not without controversy. People felt that commemorating the history of the Manhattan Project could also mean celebrating atomic weapons. So this was a bipartisan, there were sort of like bipartisan supporters and bipartisan haters. It was a really interesting process to watch. So on both sides of the aisle, people didn't want new parks because they felt that we didn't have the funding to support new parks. And people who are fans of the Park Service felt that bringing in another park would somehow jeopardize funding to the current units that were really being underfunded, right? So this was going back and forth when really, I think heritage tourism was the one sort of argument that really sort of tipped that needle, which was everyone could agree that the Park Service branding of these local efforts would be likely to bring in money to these communities. And because the delegations were pushing this, there were 3 states involved, they had enough clout to eventually get it through the legislative process. Had a couple of bumps and starts, so this was introduced in 2012, introduced again in 2013, and then finally was inserted into a public lands package into the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2015. Not normally the way parks are established. This funds the military. So that was also very controversial, but you know, it didn't get cut out at the last minute. It got stuck in there, and there were other parks besides the Manhattan Project Park. In fact, I believe Vice Caldera's language was in that Public Lands Act as well. So it was authorized in 2014, and there were some key provisions though. Just by signing that legislation, it didn't mean there was a park, but there was a time limit. Within 1 year, it had to be established, and the way it was established was going to be a formal agreement between the Department of Energy and the Department of Interior. Basically, the Park Service and the DOE would consult to determine which of the park areas would be initially part of the park. And the way the legislation was written is pretty interesting. You'll see today that there are parts of the park that are still eligible for inclusion, and there are parts of the park that are currently within the official boundaries of the park. And the reason that was done is because the Department of Energy still owns and will continue to own many of the properties. So they really wanted to be able to roll out what was going to be added to the park. But they didn't want to have to go back to Congress every time and say, hey, can we add this building, can we add this building? So the legislation cast a pretty wide net and lists pretty much every type of building, every Manhattan Project building in Los Alamos, captured most of the buildings in Oak Ridge and at Hanford. And then those could be added in later with just an agreement between the 2 agencies, and it wouldn't have to go back to Congress. So that was a pretty smart part of the legislation. They did go and sign this MOA a year later. And the key provisions, though, and these were stipulated in the legislation. So the MOA was just pretty much rewriting a lot of the terms that were in the legislation. But the key terms were that the key terms included enhanced public access, which that meant that DOE had to consider that, right? Couldn't just say no, we're going to have a park but no one can see it, right? They have to consider enhanced public access. The DOE will still manage the park and own the properties and control access. The Park Service will be in charge of interpretation because that's what they do, right? And they will assist the Department of Energy with historic preservation because they have pretty much the country's experts in a lot of restoration and preservation work. So, and I think I just said all. But, so the DOE will retain ownership of its properties and also retain responsibility for environmental cleanup. That's a very important part, right? Some of these areas are in industrial, they are industrial sites within areas that were used during World War II. And, you know, there are hazardous constituents in the area. There are still risks in some of these areas. Structural safety. These buildings, some of them were abandoned for more than 50 years, right? With no maintenance at all, right? The DOE, because it's a federal agency owning the building, would still take on the historic building compliance or the historic preservation compliance aspects. We still consult with the SHPO on all the work that we do, and it's responsible for maintenance and safe access. Again, DOE is not going to let anyone on site to visit the park and thinking about public safety, national security, and the ongoing mission of the DOE. The Park Service will have ultimate decision-making authority for the content of historic interpretation, and that is really significant for this park because the history of the use of nuclear weapons, of atomic weapons, to end World War II is a very controversial history. And it's one that I don't think over the years the Department of Energy has wanted to explore the same way that the Park Service will explore and will interpret for the American public. So I think this is one of the best reasons for having the Park Service involved in this, in being partners with us in this park. And also, like I said, an advisory role in preserving the buildings. Okay, so we haven't even been a park year because on November 10th of 2015, that's when the park was established. And they did officially establish those 3 sites: Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and Hanford, Washington. Okay, so part of this discussion today is thinking about the next century of parks. Right? I think I was trying to allude to that in my title, a new park, right, for the new century. A new century of parks. Right? So this is a multi-state, multi-agency park. Right now there's no National Park Service land or property ownership. Right? So that's very important. When you think of the parks from the 20th century, our major large parks, right? The land was appropriated, the Park Service owns the land. You know, Yosemite, Yellowstone, Grand Canyon. This is different. The Park Service doesn't own any of the buildings or any of the properties to date. It's also really important that this is a partnership with local governments. Local governments see this as great for heritage tourism, economic development, and so they are, even though they aren't official park partners right now, they are, this last year, I know all of the different communities have been incredibly engaged in making the park a success because they see that this is important to the communities. So we right now have partners in the Tri-Cities area in Washington, Oak Ridge, and their AMSI Museum, the Los Alamos County, Los Alamos Historical Society, the Department of Energy, and the National Park Service. And I think in the future, you're going to see more and more parks set up like this. So, park locations, just in case you're a little bit geographically challenged. Hanford, Washington, here in the corner, and actually right on the Columbia River. It's really a neat place. I would encourage you, if you're ever out there, you're going to hear a lot of sad stories from me about how people can't see what's at Los Alamos, but at Hanford, you can take a wonderful tour of the B reactor, and it's just a marvelous opportunity. So they are touring parts of the park up there today. Oak Ridge, Tennessee also has public tours, and they have a pretty robust museum presence with their AMSI Museum. But having it spread out across the country is also a challenge. So our current park headquarters, oh, and believe me, the fight over the headquarters, man, it's like sibling rivalry because Oak Ridge was like, well, we were the administrative head of the Manhattan Project, and Hanford's like, well, what about us? People forget about us. And Los Alamos, oh, you know, we're kind of snobby because we have name recognition. I mean, so it was going back and forth and back and forth. And so, like good parents, the DOE and the Department of Interior decided that the park headquarters would be in Denver. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the properties, and I'm just checking my time here to make sure I'm not going over. Okay, so I will speed up just a tiny bit. So, you guys all know the history of the Manhattan Project, right? Cold, right? All the dates, all the key events, all the key players? Yes, right, of course. Right. Well, so bear with me while I go over a little bit of this information. I think it's important to understand why these places were chosen, where they're located, what the role that they play in the story. So, one of the biggest challenges to atomic weapons, to making atomic weapons during World War II, they had a couple of challenges. One, they had to produce a fissile material used in the weapons, right? Fissile uranium, fissile plutonium. So all you have to do is remember uranium, Oak Ridge, plutonium, Hanford, okay? That's all you have, that's the only fact you have. There was a quiz, that's all you have to remember. And then, that material makes it's its way to Los Alamos. Los Alamos scientists design, test, assemble all the weapon parts, and voila, all right? That's basically the history of the Manhattan Project. However, there's a really important distinction between Oak Ridge and Hanford and Los Alamos. In order to develop, in order to produce small amounts of fissile material, they had to develop huge industrial plants, right? In order to design and build and test the bomb, we were working in garages and cabins in Los Alamos. And I kid you not, all right? So when you think about the stories of Oak Ridge, Tennessee, Hanford, Washington, and how to compare that with Los Alamos, think scale, right? Scale. Pretty much all three areas are kind of remote, but Oak Ridge, they don't like to be called remote. We were at a conference the other day and they said, oh, we're really not that remote. But they did take a huge amount of land, okay, and they developed industrial areas in this series of ridges in the Oak Ridge, Tennessee area where they built this massive K-25 uranium processing plant and the Y-12 complex, and they also have the X-10 graphite reactor. So these sites are really important because without them, we could not have developed a little white weapon, because this is where the uranium came from. So today, in Oak Ridge, because they're so spread out with this sort of series of ridges and this very large area of the Oak Ridge Reservation, the way that they are engaging the public in the park is they currently have their visitor center at the American Museum of Science and Energy, which is downtown in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. And then they have different visits and different planned trips to the different spokes. So it's a hub and spoke concept. K-25, which in that earlier slide I showed you is partially demolished, is now completely gone. So the K-25 is within the park, it's within the park boundaries, but it is really just the footprint. And there was a lot of going back and forth on whether or not K-25 should be retained, or even a portion of K-25 should be retained. But in the end, they decided to develop a history center, and so you can go out there and they're going to be displaying the massive footprint of the plant, and I think it'll be a really great visitor experience. But it is interesting that that particular facility is not there, but it is part of the park. The other areas at Oak Ridge are fairly similar to Los Alamos in terms of their active mission areas, and so the Y-12 complex is not an area where you can actually go out into the buildings, but they do have a history center on site. A lot of this visitor infrastructure was already there before the park, and you'll see as I go through this that Los Alamos, because of our mission, we don't really have visitor facilities. Oak Ridge and Hanford were kind of all well ahead of us along this path. We're going to catch up. We'll catch up. So the X-10 graphite reactor is a really important facility. It was one of the signature facilities that's now in the park, and that you can see on a public tour. The X-10 graphite reactor was not used, though, for uranium production. It was a prototype for the B reactor at Hanford. In fact, they call it the baby B. This is the world's second reactor after the Chicago pile. All right. Now, I said that most of the properties were owned by the Department of Energy. The Alexander Guest House is park eligible. It's not in the park today, but it could be added without having to go back to Congress. It has been converted to a retirement center, and it's in the downtown Oak Ridge area. General Groves used to stay here, so say no more. It's like, so at Hanford, we have pretty much a different setting. It's a flat area. If you've ever been out into eastern Washington, it's right next to the Columbia River. There's a lot of agriculture out there historically, and they were using a lot of the hydroelectric power from the Columbia River to run these giant reactor plants, reactor facilities. So in the park today, we have the B reactor, and it's hard to tell the scale unless you're really out there driving down the road and there's these large reactor monoliths on the horizon. It's quite dramatic. It was actually declared a National Historic Landmark in 2008 before it was part of the park. And they've done a tremendous job in interpretation, cleaning it up, and there's these really wonderful docent-led tours. I would certainly recommend going there and learning all about the plutonium reaction. Again, these are industrial-sized plants. The tea plant was nicknamed Queen Mary. These are just amazingly large facilities doing nothing but processing plutonium. At Hanford, they actually rolled in a couple of pre-Manhattan areas as part of the park legislation. We weren't actually given that option, so the legislative process wasn't actually even in each site. But it was so important for Hanford to be able to tell the story of the displaced towns. So Hanford is the reservation. When I say Hanford, Washington, it's not a town. It's the DOE reservation. The town of Hanford was completely displaced, and there's not much left of it. It was taken over by the war effort, and people had to leave their town. Also, there was another town, White Bluffs, in the same area, and those people were also displaced. They still live in the Tri-Cities area, and so they have very strong attachments to that pre-Manhattan Project history and to where they used to live. And I think that's why the congressional delegation pushed so hard to get these pre-Manhattan Project properties in there. So there's the Hanford High School and the Hanford Construction Camp that are part of the park. And the high school is just essentially a shell that they're going to restore. And they are starting to give tours of this area as well. When you go on your B-reactor tour, there's another tour so you can go see these facilities. And they're within the boundaries of the Hanford Reservation, which is controlled and owned by the Department of Energy. So these are special tours. You can't just drive in. The White Bluffs Bank Building they're restoring, and the Allard Pump House. All of these speak to the towns that were displaced, and also the earliest agricultural practices, the farming, the orchards that were out there before the war effort. And here's Bruggerman's Warehouse, which is a very unique and interesting building. But again, just the remains of that agricultural period. Now, here we are in Los Alamos. Okay, so how many of you, see it's toward the end of the talk, how many of you have been to northern New Mexico, Los Alamos? Okay, pretty familiar with the town. Okay, so there is a historic district in downtown Los Alamos. It's where the ranch school buildings are, it's where the master's houses for the ranch school are, and they're privately owned or owned by the county. They are listed in the legislation. They're not part of the park yet. They can be rolled in as partnership properties in the future, but the real hurdle for this park was to get an agreement between the Department of Interior and the Department of Energy. So I'm going to focus on those properties that are what we call behind the fence. So here are a few views of the downtown buildings. We do have a couple of World War II built. This is our built buildings. This is the East Cafeteria, which is now a performing arts center, also known as the Little Theater. And we do have, as part of the downtown portfolio, Oppenheimer's house, which is actually owned right now, owned by the Los Alamos Historical Society. This is the laboratory during the war around Ashley Pond, but all of the World War II administrative and office buildings, light labs, the chemistry laboratories, they were all torn down in the 60s. So if you go to downtown Los Alamos, you are not going to see that much evidence of the Manhattan Project. You're going to see the ranch school, but you're not going to see the buildings where the bombs were designed and built. But there are 17 buildings behind the fence that are either in the park today or eligible for the park. And those are the ones that I manage. And I have been managing for several years now, and I'm very, very excited at the end of my career to be able to affect change and have these properties preserved relatively in perpetuity. They tell various stories of the history of the Manhattan Project at Los Alamos. So if you're not that familiar with Los Alamos, over here, town site is at the top, the lovely bedroom community where I live. White Rock is over here. And this whole area here is the boundary of the laboratory, which is off limits to the general public. And the majority of the park properties that are either in the park or park eligible are within our active weapons mission area, with a small little note here at Tajarito Site TA-18. So, but I like to say that if you take them all together, right, even the more famous buildings and the less famous buildings that are remain, they tell the scientific and technical story of the development of Vermont. And that you really need to know the story of all 17 of those properties to really understand the efforts that were going on in Los Alamos. And like I said, scale, right? So this is Gunsight. I'm just going to go through these fairly quickly. Gunsight was where Little Boy was developed. Here's a picture of it today, where this white staining is here. There used to be a periscope tower. One of my dream restoration projects is going to be to rebuild this tower. During World War II, there were guns up here on top. The scientists would be down here in these bunkered buildings, and they would be remotely detonating Navy guns. So, the reason for the guns. In 1943, Oppenheimer came to town in 1942, but in 1943, when they were first developing the laboratory, they thought, well, you know, we have a surefire way of building an atomic weapon. There's just one method. We'll be able to use uranium, we'll be able to use plutonium, we'll get it done in about 6 months, you know, and we're done, right? No problem. And this method was called the gun assembled method. And essentially, it was taking a subcritical mass of fissile material and shooting it at another subcritical mass, joining them together, right, at high speeds in a pretty small area, right? And that's all they were going to do. Have your nuclear explosion, and then we're done, right? Unfortunately, it wasn't that simple. This is the failed Thin Man weapon. These are weapons without their casings, by the way. Thin Man was going to be using plutonium, and Little Boy, this is the uranium one, okay? You're shooting subcritical mass here to a subcritical target over here. Same thing, right? Up there and there. Unfortunately, plutonium could not be used in this method, and that was discovered, I kid you not, we had cabins where the scientists were working at a remote location. They were studying plutonium chemistry, and they realized they could not use the plutonium in that gun assembled method. That caused the crisis of 1944. This is actually our primitive scientific experiment in a log cabin. So it caused the crisis of 1944. And essentially Groves and Oppenheimer were faced with this real problem. We've got all this plutonium coming from, where's the plutonium coming from? Hanford, okay? We don't have a bomb. We don't have a design for that bomb. So they had to design another bomb. It was the implosion method, what we call today the Fat Man weapon. So it involved the creation of, the hiring of hundreds of people in 1944, the development of an entire very large high explosives area, and special test areas, just to design this very complicated weapon. So these are buildings that are associated with that push in 1944 to develop Fat Man weapon. And I won't go into too much scientific detail on these, but just to give you an idea, they're very small. These are bunkers, control bunkers. They housed a Betatron radiation emitting machine and a cloud chamber, which captured the data for the scientists. I am not a scientist, so I can't tell you much more than that. They had firing pits to basically observe the results of implosion. So, and very quickly tell you, so implosion was essentially taking that same subcritical mass that you were shooting back and forth, but actually just making it more dense by squeezing it with high explosives. So if you think of this round ball of high explosives and a plutonium pit in the middle, and you've got to set everything off in perfect simultaneously with detonators, and it has to be a symmetrical inward explosion. That's what implosion is, an inward explosion. So they had all of these facilities that were just developed, different areas behind the fence that exist today, just to study that problem. So here's another one, high-speed cameras. Another way of looking inside of an explosion, and using the disruption of magnetic fields to look inside an explosion. Then we have our V-site, which, so this is what it looks like today, after restoration, just the two buildings that remain. And V-site was where the gadget over here. Here's the gadget as it looked pretty much leaving Los Alamos. Here's the gadget on the tower at Trinity. And here's some weaponization work. This is the only photograph we have of V-site during the war because it was so top secret. We also had experimental areas. If you're familiar with White Sands in the Trinity test, you may know about Jumbo, right? Jumbo was a steel containment vessel because they were concerned that the Trinity test would fizzle and that the plutonium would go off into the sky and we wouldn't have that much plutonium left. So plutonium recovery was a problem. So the concrete bowl was an experimental platform built in Los Alamos to study a water method of recovering plutonium. And that's what that bowl looked like. This is a 200-foot diameter prototype. And then here's the Quonset hut. Same Quonset hut that I began my talk with. It's still there, and it was used for final assembly of the Fat Man units sent to the Pacific and dropped on Nagasaki. So here's some pictures. And then you might look at this last slide here and wonder, why do I have a building built in 1946? This is not the Manhattan Project. Isn't the Manhattan Project over at the end of the war? Well, actually, the Manhattan Project did not end until the beginning of January of 1947, January 1st, with the passage of the Atomic Energy Act and with the transition between the military and the Atomic Energy Commission at that juncture. And that's the end, the actual technical end of the Manhattan Project. And this building is going to be one of our most difficult buildings, believe it or not, to interpret, because this is the story of the loose slope accident, often referred to as a form of tickling the dragon's tail experiment, where in the course of his experiment, the screwdriver slipped and he produced a criticality accident that essentially led to his death and irradiated everyone else in the room. If you want to delve into this, just look at the Wikipedia page on the slope accident. It has been in novels, plays, poetry. This is really an accident that has been absorbed, I think, by our national anxiety and national consciousness. All right, so I know I'm looking over there, Peter. I got like 2 minutes here. So one of our big challenges this first year is a new park, right? It's a brand new kind of park. A new organizational framework within the laboratory, right? The laboratory was, I was asked, why didn't you prepare for this park? Well, we didn't think it was ever going to pass Congress, so we didn't spend any time preparing for something that we didn't think was ever going to happen. And at the time, Congress was not really passing any kind of legislation. So this balancing the public access with the active DOE mission has been a major challenge for this park, and not just in Los Alamos, but in Oak Ridge and Hanford as well. Funding. Lack of funding for both agencies, both the Department of Energy and the National Park Service. Specific funding has yet to be allocated for the implementation of this park. And the physical condition of the park properties in the park areas. They are essentially what we've been doing over the years is pulling the buildings off the demolition list and trying to keep them standing. That is a far cry from being able to open the doors for public visitors, right? We have ADA requirements, we have other issues. How do we get people safely into the buildings? And the official park properties, which are, so don't forget your handout when you leave, are in this handout, are not actually open to visitors. So we have a handout here, it talks to, there's a nice walking tour in downtown Los Alamos. On the flip side, it says these areas are not currently open to the public. So what are our successes and opportunities? I'll just pick the highlights in here. We've been really working with our local communities. And this is Oak Ridge, Hanford, and Los Alamos, and the city governments, and the Park Service. Friends groups, people are really supportive of the park. And they understand that the challenges that we're facing to launch this park in active mission areas at the laboratory. We've developed interagency agreements with the Park Service to help us with preservation projects. We're developing joint operating plans and that draft park foundation document that I talked about. We actually had our very first, he's very nice, his name is Kirk Singer, is our very first park ranger in Los Alamos. And we just, Chris Kirby is the new park superintendent, she was just appointed. We've been doing outreach and communication products. This brochure was actually a joint project between the DOE, LANL, the Park Service, Los Alamos County, and the Historical Society. So that was an exciting product. And we also have an app available for free download, Apple Store, Android Store. So it's sort of a 3D way, you can, or just a kind of a gamified way you can learn about the history of the Manhattan Project. Looking ahead, we're hoping to see expanded ranger-led programs, additional Park Service staff, a lot more interpretive work this next year, and we're going to try to explore some of the themes in the foundation document and try to start telling the history of the Manhattan Project in a little bit different way than has been told. So we will focus on the displacement angle, local population. We talk about experiences of workers, not just the top scientists, not just Oppenheimer and Teller and Feynman. We're going to talk about the enlisted military and the women who are working out, and some of them in the technical areas. We're going to talk about, the Park Service is going to talk about the decision to use the bomb and the consequences. We're going to work on restoration projects, and we're already starting inventorying all of our Manhattan Project artifacts and looking into our oral histories. And we're trying to think about how we're going to do enhanced public access. So for the interpretation and programming, we're going to talk about the pre-Manhattan Project history, the experiences of women, the experience of enlisted men, and that decision to use the bomb, and the consequences today, the geopolitical legacies. We're going to work on these preservation projects. We've got some pretty dilapidated buildings. The Pond Cabin on the lower right is over 100 years old, and the Park Service is going to work on it with us. We're also going to look at controlled public access. If you remember the map of the laboratory, and I talked about the little node that was over on the side of the Pomerito site, it is pretty much outside of active mission area. So this will be the first place that we will hopefully open to the public in the next year or so. There we go. Sorry. I always wanted to work for the Park Service, and so this is, my way of having for the Park Service. We get these partnership shirts with official arrowheads on them, and I have a little Park Service hat I wear for tours. So. Any questions? Yeah.
Yes, the Manhattan, the Trinity site where the bomb was tested. Are you thinking about maybe possibly integrating that into the historical park, or would that just mainly stick with the laboratories in Los Alamos and Oak Ridge and Hanford?
So that's really, I would say, the kind of the elephant in the room, because that is the place that really is so historically significant that is not part of the park currently. That facility, that area is owned by the Department of Defense, and they were not in this initial park legislation. However, the McDonald Ranch, Ground Zero area, they are National Historic Landmarks, and because of this park, in fact, somebody here might need to know more about it. They are actually doing Park Service is doing some active restoration on the McDonald Ranch building, and I think partly because we had tours as part of the visits by the high-level Park Service folks. We actually took them down to Trinity site and pointed out that really this should be part of the park in the future, and I think that helped with some of the repairs that were done to the building. But I do think in the future, if I had anything to do with it, I think that the Trinity site will ultimately need to be part of the park. It is considered an associated or affiliated area right now, although there isn't a real legal category for that. That's just something, as we're doing the foundation document, you'll see that, yes, Trinity site is acknowledged. Also, some of our Cold War sites. We have some very intriguing and interesting Cold War sites at Los Alamos, and our local folks wanted us to add them into the park boundaries. They weren't in the legislation, but they might be added legislatively later. So if you've heard of, if you're familiar with Los Alamos, we have our front gate, the East Gate Guard Tower, which was built in 1948, so it missed the Manhattan Project cut off. And also, there's a tunnel. It goes 200 feet into the cliff in Los Alamos Canyon. It's a Cold War tunnel that there's a lot of interest in seeing that as part of the legacy of the Manhattan Project and that continuing Cold War story. So I think there's going to be, in the future, other buildings rolled in, not just the ones that are park eligible today, but if they're added legislatively, they'll probably be added in. Yeah.
Thank you.
Is there presently any, like a museum or anything in Los Alamos?
Yes, so we have a visitor contact station or visitor center for the park. It's a very small couple of rooms with our one ranger in it. And if you go there, you'll get the little walking tour. And there's programming once a day by the ranger. There's also the Los Alamos Historical Society, which is undergoing an incredible expansion, and they're adding to their museum right now. They're renovating their museum and adding sort of a museum campus. Not only do they own the Oppenheimer House, which is currently occupied, it's sort of a life trust. The owner can stay in it as long as, well, the woman who's living in it will stay in that house as long as she wants, but when she leaves, the Historical Society owns the house, will then be able to open that for house tours. Also, there's another house on Bathtub Road that they are planning to have as a public house museum. It's another one of the master's cottages. So there will be more to see. We also have a really nice science museum, the Bradbury Science Museum in downtown Los Alamos. So there's things to see. There's at least a half a day of things to do in Los Alamos. Plus, we're thinking that in the future, Los Alamos will be the gateway community to the Valles Caldera and also Bandolera. So there's 3 parks, so you can get your cultural history, your scientific history, and your natural beauty all in one wonderful day. That's a plan. Any questions? Yeah.
Is there a estimated completion date or a goal date when Los Alamos site will be open to?
So, my favorite word in government ease is it's funding, funding related or it's funding dependent. So right now we have the funding that what we have right now to implement the park is within our existing budget for the laboratory. Should we get additional funding, then we can start looking at the visitor amenities. Because right now, although we are planning, and I'll go back one slide if I can, we are planning we're starting to open up this area. If you're from Los Alamos and you know where Pajarito Road is, you can't drive up and down this road today, it's closed off. But you used to be able to drive up and down this road. And at night, this whole thing was like lit up, like it had concertina wire. It was a facility full of buildings. Well, actually, this building is left. This is the cabin. That's the Slotin building, and that's one of the implosion bunkers down there, and one more building. And everything else has been actually demolished in the last couple of years. So we're starting that site cleanup, and we're also starting planning for public access. It would be controlled bus visits, though. So you would have to go through some sort of screening, board the bus at a public place, come down, go through our checkpoint here, and then visit the site with a ranger. That's probably at least a couple of years out, and we're thinking we're going to try to do some windshield bus tours first, especially because we are in the process of repairing these buildings, and even though it looks like this open space, these are foundations of former buildings, so we don't have like safe walking. We don't have paths, right? We don't have interpretive panels. We don't have porta potties. It's like a desert out there. So there's a lot of work to make this safe for just to be able to walk around and enjoy yourself out there. But this is our first target area. Yes.
First of all, when the park expands, I know a great group of graduate students that are going to need some jobs. The second question is, a lot of us have examined, or a lot of us know about the controversy over the Enola Gay 50-year anniversary at the Smithsonian. What are the lessons? What might be the lessons from those events to interpretation of Los Alamos at the Manhattan Project? Or
you're just feeding right into my dissertation, but that's okay. All right. So that's a really good point, because this is a very controversial history. It's very polarizing. even with a lot of the World War II veterans who were actively engaged in the Enola Gay controversy, even though many of those folks are no longer around or alive, there's still this sort of polarizing argument about the use of the weapons, ending the war to save lives, and people are very passionate about this story. It's not just the Enola Gay controversy. There was a children's peace sculpture in Los Alamos. It was planned for Los Alamos. It was very controversial years ago. There's the peace bell at Oak Ridge, Japanese peace bell at Oak Ridge, and that has been very controversial over the years. So this sort of public commemoration also brings a lot of heated dialogue. And so what I feel that the Park Service will allow us to do is they're not going to take sides. This is going to be a safe space or space for dialogue, and that people can come in and learn about, if they want to learn about worker experiences and not have to grapple with the morality of nuclear weapons, they can learn about that, right? If they want to learn about the science, they don't want, or they want to learn about the human consequences, all this information will be available, and people can have dialogues and talk about it and learn about it. And so when the park legislation was being considered, people were like, we don't want to talk about this. Why do we want to have this history out here? And the counter argument is, we don't want to sweep it under the rug, right? If you are passionately against the use of weapons and you really don't like this history, right? We don't want to just ignore it either, right? We don't want to forget it. We don't want to forget our past. So I think this, and the other flip side of that is, there's a lot of information out there. There's books, there's websites, right? But I tell you, when you go into the Slotin building, right, and you stand there, I had school teachers, the one tour I've done out there with school teachers, they had just seen the movie Fat Man and Little Boy, where this accident is dramatized, and John Cusack is Louis Slotin, and he dies a horrible death. And Laura Dern is his long-suffering nurse girlfriend. I don't know if you've seen this movie, right? They were typical school teachers. They were all chatty, got off the bus, right? They walked into this building. The building is an empty room. There's no interpretation. There is nothing. We don't show the footprints where people were standing. They just stopped talking. They stopped talking. This building is kind of as a shrine. There is something about the building, if you know about the accident and you know about the power that was unleashed in that accident, and that it happened right at the time that most of the people in this country were finally realizing what happened to the Japanese, right? There was a lag, where they didn't really understand what was going on with radiation burns, and the lingering effects of the bombings of Japan. That was really getting into the national press right when this accident happened. And so it's a really powerful, moving story that has, that resonates today, still resonates today. So these places are so powerful, even a very simple building, right? The site, right? The gadget, the core parts of a gadget were assembled in that building. It's like a garage. When you walk into that building, most people say, wow, this world-changing event, right? And they were working in a simple wooden garage, and with 4 or 5 young 25-year-olds. Right? Those are the kinds of the stories that, so it doesn't have to polarize, right? People can experience the story and the history without having to take a side, or they can take a side, right? But I think the Park Service is much better poised to be able to facilitate dialogue than the Department of Energy, right, which has a certain role, right, or the, and we have a lot of groups that are anti-nuclear groups that can be part of this dialogue as well. So and that's the exciting part about this history. In fact, if it weren't controversial, it'd be kind of boring. I mean, in fact, the Park Service, when they first started this, they weren't sure they wanted to have anything to do with the bomb story. They really did. High-level Park Service people. But as they've been exploring it, they now think that this is really one of the most important stories of the 20th century that we have to tell because it still affects us today, right? Think of current events today, right? North Korea, Russia, right? It's still a really important story to understand because of what's going on today and the continuing places.
North Korea.
North Korea, yeah, exactly. exactly. So, anyway, I'm just excited because the very places are being preserved. Because I'm an archaeologist, material culture person, that's my first passion, and being able to actually save some of the built environment so people can go there and say, wow, I'm standing right here where this happened. It's part of why people want to go to parks. Any other questions?